Kumke from the Food Bank of Lincoln. So please help me welcome her to.
Thanks, Christina. Oh, yeah, that's right. I like it. Well, hello. I've had a chance to speak to some of you. Some of you I know, and that is a little daunting to be in front of you for that reason. Some of you I don't know, but you look familiar or your name seems familiar. So it's a pleasure to be here. I hope that I can offer one tiny nugget of wisdom from my experience, and we'll just jump right in. When Janet asked if I would come and speak to the group, I said, oh, sure. And then I thought, what did I just do? And the reason why is because in nonprofit communications, like with a small business or even a large business working with small departments, the resources are limited. The time and the commitments that we're able to make to different projects is highly limited. And so it doesn't always feel like you could be an authority on that topic. And certainly in nonprofit communications, when I think about the different balls that we're juggling at the Food Bank of Lincoln and my role there, I love internal communications, but it's just a sliver of what I do overall. And when we think about what is the difference, that's pretty basic, that when we're talking about internal communications, we're looking at our group of colleagues from management down to frontline workers, and figuring out how we're connecting a message of some action. Do we want to create awareness about a health initiative inside the organization? Or are we talking about reminding people that bad weather's coming, wear good shoes, be safe? You know, Scott Young on a daily basis says, hydrate, 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 because, you know, our crew is out in the elements when they're lifting and doing some pretty exhausting activity, visiting, you know, picking up food and things like that. So that one message, I think everybody has that one down flat. And that might be an indicator of when you know you're successful at something, when everybody can anticipate that Scott's next line will be, and hydrate. But that's in part why I was brought on to the food bank. When I was hired, my supervisor really said, I want you to make internal communications a serious part of your focus. And the reason is because there's so much activity happening at our places of work, right? So many different ways that we're stretched thin, and we're trying to ensure that our main message is getting outside of the building, but that doesn't happen effectively unless we're communicating well internally. And so it reminded me of when I was actually working at Lincoln Children's Museum. There, I would be fascinated watching children with the simplest of concepts, right? So the tin can telephone, 2 tin cans, string, and an audience, right? Communication is really that simple, but we as adults have this innate way of just making it highly complicated. And so every time I think about internal communications, or when we're having issues and I can't quite figure out why it's not effective, most often it's because we've made something too complicated. And so kind of one way that it all started, when I did my annual review most recently, John, my supervisor, shared something that it was a compliment, but also a challenge. He said, I am so impressed how you managed to know so much about everybody, like more so than he has in the 2 times the amount of time that he's been there. Just these weird, interesting facts about people. Like the fact that Anna's high school age daughter is interested both in track and theater. Or that for Tommy, it's really important to him that we greet people. That's very personal to him. That's kind of a thing. Or for Karen, she loves roses because her middle name is Rose, and that's just sort of become a symbol for her. And then finally for Gary, and this is really important, any of you who have ever met or seen Gary Lockett, one of our rural food distribution drivers, he has a serious weakness for ice cream and smooth jazz, so just keep that in mind. But these are the kinds of things that as the communications director, I take time to get to know this about my colleagues, because what those little things can do is start to shape how I communicate to people, or the messages that they might help extend to other colleagues, that if I can plant a seed, then they can help share that message. So it's one of those things that it is a basic thing. It is connecting with people and listening and understanding, but also remembering that just because they're our colleagues doesn't mean that it's easy to ingrain that message, right? They're not the low-lying fruit that it seems like it is, because every day when we come into work, we're battling that headspace. We are challenging, or competing rather, for what's happening. Maybe it was the burrito that they had the night before, so they have heartburn. or maybe it's that there's some office politics that are distracting somebody from focusing on the mission message that we're really trying to get across. So those things are affecting all of us. And the other point of that is it's not just the people receiving it, it's the people sharing that. I have to remember too that when I'm communicating that message, that I am fully present and that I'm remembering, what was the point of me sharing that this is part of the weekly update, that today we're gonna be out in Wahoo? Why does that matter, And letting people know, if you can't find Mary, it's because she's doing an agency checkup today. So letting people know those things and not getting distracted by my own agenda of, I have to present today too. But the thing that gets me is that as simple as communication is, we can be our own worst enemies. This quote, some of you may have read it before, and it's something that I actually, Amber Pankinen, you may know from Stirless, but she shared this once on a social media, and it absolutely resonated with me. And so I have this quote printed and in 2 locations. One I post on my door, and one I have framed above my monitor. And it's this reminder that the listening piece is as much, if not more important than what we're pushing out. We can't formulate a message until we understand what's coming in or what need we're trying to meet in that communication. And I have an embarrassing example of a time when I failed to do this. So the way that I collect the stories from employees, if there's a new hire, I always sit down and do a one-on-one. And I want to write up a little profile that we'll use internally and externally. And it so happened the timing with Pedro that we were right up against a newsletter deadline. And I sat down with Pedro, who is an absolute delight, and he shared some information about his backstory. Pedro shared that he grew up in Ecuador during a pretty challenging time. There were gangs, violence, riots, and he decided that he was going to be moving. He wanted to get his family out into safety, so they moved to LA. And actually, he was just a single man at that time. But that's when he met Raquel, and they started their life, and he was a bus driver in LA for many, many years. And then he decided that they wanted to find a different pace for their now growing family. And they came to Lincoln, Nebraska. And shortly thereafter, Pedro started working at the food bank as one of our drivers. And I thought I understood everything that he was saying. There was a little bit of a language barrier, not too much. And I thought I was listening. Turns out I wrote that story and I was listening for a deadline. I wasn't listening to hear all of Pedro's story, because I confused that the riots that he was leaving, they weren't in Ecuador yet. Things were rough there, and he was leaving because of certain circumstances. It was when he was in LA. That I made a bad assumption when he left LA because the gang riots and activity was getting so bad that he wanted his family to be safe. That's when they moved to Nebraska. But I shared that story and I printed it without having him approve it, which I never do. and it's the one time that and it went printed into our newsletter, and I was so excited when it came out, and I took it to Pedro, and he said, Michaella, this isn't right. Oh, I was just crushed. And the thing about that was that could have really jeopardized the trust that Pedro and I would have, and my understanding of him and how he would share stories with me, because every single employee at the food bank is a source for other stories for me to share our clients or our partners' stories. And I told Pedro, apologized genuinely and profusely, and we talked a little bit about it, and I said, Pedro, unfortunately, I can't fix it in the printed version that's been sent out, but I can fix the online version. And so made that correction, and he was very kind about it. But that's an example of when we get into such a hurry and we forget that the listening is the fundamental. You have to listen to understand, not to meet a deadline, and not to share your opinion about something. So with that, that's sort of my mantra. It has become my mantra. And that's why I have that posted and as a reminder for myself, but also to my colleagues. And when it comes to communication, we have to remember that we have to listen and do our research of our internal audience in every single opportunity. It could be something that you overhear in the lunchroom. It could be what you see on your colleagues' social media if you're connected on that platform or those platforms. It might be something that you have in the job description that you discuss, but they're all connected, and those are all sources of collecting this information so that we can disseminate the main message, that whatever that may be. And when we're thinking about our internal communication, the tone of it is so important, and where. So I was actually visiting an offsite office recently, and I saw this interesting, this sign. Just give you a minute to read that. This was hanging in the restroom. It says, "Women and cats do as they please. Men and dogs should relax and get used to the idea." I thought, that's interesting. Remembering that every space is an internal communication space. I can see the humor in it. I also wonder if that's the tone that you want to share with your colleagues. Is that the vibe that you want, not just your colleagues, but your guests? So I think there's a time and a place for any kind of humor, and I'm certainly a big fan of laughing. But this just really struck me, and it reminded me, because I've read that one of the main locations for internal communication, for effective internal communication, is in the bathroom. Makes sense. But we have to think about what messages do we intend to send and which ones do we not intend to send. And that message, we start that from the very beginning, very early on. It might start with a visit. Say I was here for an interview. That would sort of tell me something. It would set the tone about the culture of this place of work. And speaking of tone, a friend of mine, Trent Wilcox, is president at Unanimous, and he recently asked, as kind of somebody outside of his direct realm, if I would take a look at their employee handbook. And I have to say, this is a great example of internal communications from the start. Now, Trent talks a lot about, the cobbler's children have no shoes, right? So he said it was a time-consuming, exhausting labor of love, but they're very proud of this 39-page document that gives people a great sense of who they are, why they've recruited them to work there, and what they expect of their employees. So that message, that tone and messaging happens from the very start and continues as long as that relationship lasts, very intentionally or unintentionally. And we're not going through all 39 pages, but I think it's a description of the humor, that's important to that workplace. They're kind of a clever bunch. They're not afraid of being a little dorky. They own that, but they're experts in their field. And so I think that's a great example of how tone can matter, and making sure that you're consistent with who you are and what you want your employees to know they're either signing up for or they're representing. On the flip side, another kind of tone, this is in Madonna Rehabilitation Hospital, and I worked at Madonna for 7 years in the marketing and communications department. And this was one of my absolute favorite projects. The challenge from the CEO at that time was to tell the Madonna story, but not the historical story, the story about our patients and the outcomes and the successes. And I just took this picture last week. The photos have changed, but this very format and the quotes and things remain part of the bones now. And I'm really proud of it because it was a long process, but in each of these pictures, the internal communications that's happening here, we highlighted people from different departments intentionally. We wanted to show their hands-on how important the work is at Madonna, that it doesn't happen unless those healthcare employees are really engaged and problem solve. So much of rehabilitation is about problem solving. And it was a testament to the accomplishments of the human spirit of our patients there, but also the collaboration that has to happen with the healthcare workers. And so I still get chills when I go down this hall because there is something special that happens there, and I think that story, it's because of the colleagues and their commitment to it. That's why it happens, not because a CEO said, let's make a wall and make it pretty. That dreaded question or challenge is to make it pretty. That's not what it was about, but it was a reminder that every person in that organization has a role, and that role is to help the patients who walk through those hallways, or to help them walk through those hallways in many cases. And this is another area of the wall that celebrates the Goal Award speakers, but just sort of sets the tone too for the champions outside of the building and kind of people who we admire. Now, those are pretty formal in tone. I'm a pretty playful person, for those of you who know me even a little. And so I think the thing about communications is that you have to engage, get people excited, and get them represented. But never, never, never forget that communications is a leadership role. Even if it doesn't appear anywhere in the title or your seat at the table, sometimes that means that you do ridiculous things to send a message. This is at Lincoln Children's Museum, and there's a sign that I would remember. It was internally facing, just as guests would, as the staff would walk out onto the floor of the museum, and it was this happy little frog that said, "Grin and greet within 8 feet." Just that reminder of we're creating the experience for every one of our guests, and that we needed to lead that and model that for other colleagues. Well, I sort of took that to the next level. This is Twinkle the mascot, and we were approaching 5,000 likes on Facebook, and so we said if we got to 5,000 likes, 5K, I would run a 5K wearing the costume. And so I told our discovery team, if you'll help me share this information with your friends, help them to like our page, to build that, then I would do this. And the message there was that I wanted the staff to know I would never ask them to do something that I wouldn't do myself. Worst 5K I've ever run. The hottest for sure. And I think I still have back pain as a result. But just that idea that we have to engage our internal audiences, and then we have to lead them to the thing that we're trying to accomplish. And how we do that can look formal in a memo, or it can look like putting on a costume and running. I applied that similar concept here at the food bank. This is almost like a micro inspiration wall at Madonna, or kind of leading from within. So this is a wall hanging that is in my office. And we have been hammering the idea that the stories that we share, I can't always get out to get every story. But I need to know that there's a story out there, and that that our colleagues have made a connection with somebody. And I would put it in the weekly update as a reminder. I would send an email. Don't forget when you talk to that applicant that if it's a great story, let me know. And it was working some. And I realized I wasn't using my real estate. I don't know about you, but as the communications director, I have a lot of people who tend to stop by my office, and they want to pop in and give some other kind of update, which may or may not feel useful, but generally it is. And behind me, I used to have this old, frankly, it was from college, Hobby Lobby Kandinsky print. That was beautiful, but it wasn't really serving me well in that space. So I swapped it out. All of these are photos of clients or volunteers or outreach activities that we've done. And I'm not kidding, within 30 minutes of putting it up on my wall, I had 10 people stop by my office and ask about it. So then it gave an opportunity for me to say, oh yeah, that was at that crate distribution. Remember our first one there? That was great. And that story came because Mariana told me, and it's kind of that inserting the reminders of what you're trying to get. My goal was to remind our employees that they are my conduit to really good stories, and the really good stories are what help us express the mission and help us do our work every day. It helps us get new trucks sometimes because we can share a story about a bumpy ride that's happening. So I think just simple. Don't forget, it's a tin can, a string, and 2 people engaging. Another part of internal communications is the dreaded employee engagement survey. I don't actually dread the survey. I dread the groan, right? That employees often have. But when Gallup says 70% of the workforce is really disengaged, that's a hard place to start. So here, when we think about this, for communications professionals, the reminder is ask different questions, ask deeper questions, because when that engagement survey came back for us, the number one thing that people reported was poor communication. And I just wanted to give up. But I knew that that wasn't entirely the story. And so with Scott and John, knew that I have this thing about culture and about internal communication and leading. So I told Scott I would like to start a kind of culture club. I think across Lincoln, everybody pretty much knows of Fire Springs 1111 meeting and their culture, their cause to culture. But I wanted to take a version of that and have it at the food bank, to bring information from all areas to make sure that we were represented, because I didn't really think it was about poor communication, but I couldn't say for sure. I didn't want to assume that I knew the whole story without going a little deeper. Turns out it's not about the communication. People sometimes feel like we over-communicate. It was about people feeling trusted, respected, and a sense of accountability. And so when we dug a little bit deeper, that's what we could learn. And the realization, too, that where we communicated or how we communicated really mattered for each group. I can't expect our distribution center team to check their email regularly because they're pulling orders. They're getting donations checked in. And so it was a change of we can be accountable when our expectations are accessible. And so that's a message that we're still trying to hammer that one home and figure out how we do it. I was sharing with Christina before we started that time, that commitment, the consistency, the discipline. If you're committed to internal communications, don't even bother having that hourglass, because you're going to flip that so many times. It is a slow process, and you have to be committed to that, but to understand what is that end goal. And so for us, with our culture club, we've started to build in other areas. For the first time ever, we had an all-staff retreat last year, a day where we shut down the food bank for one day to bring the staff on the same page. And we did it again this year. And that was a big thing, and it's hard. It's not something that we necessarily want to do to close operations, but it has been the thing that employees have commented how much of a difference that has made to help colleagues get to know one another on a more personal level, but also to understand their work. And so making that commitment to asking deeper questions, and sometimes sticking your neck out and asking your executive director if you could close shop for the day for this type of activity. But it has returned positive results. Another thing that we've learned, and this is not news to anybody, it's right, we're gathered around it today, but at the food bank, go figure, food brings us together. We've used these opportunities for our potlucks we don't focus on it entirely, but we'll drop in reminders about an upcoming lunch and learn, or a guest in the building, or a donation, and use that time of gathering as an informational opportunity too. But keep that short. Just remembering that that's not the main focus. It's the being together and continuing to get to know one another. But again, it goes right back to our mission, right? Why would we think that food wasn't going to be a central thing for us? Because we know that's why we're in the work that we do, because we want to nourish folks and we want to bring them together and create that community. So, we overthought it. Here's an example. So was it last week, Amy? Yep. So we work with EBICA, a fine group dedicated to the food bank's mission as well. And I thought this was a great example of the timing of internal communications and how that can go from the inside out. So 16 years, EBICA has been in business and has done an incredible job of, that's a difficult area of work to be in, and they've persisted. And for us, when we look at this, we think, when you do a rebrand and you're committing to yourselves and sharing that message, I know, because I have close contact with Amy's employees, you can feel the synergy in their group. And so I'm going to guess that they had good discussions first there about this rebranding. They were going to be involved in it directly, but it was also going to, the idea to build the business up again. And so, so this group, when I think about the synergy and the excitement, that sometimes you have to acknowledge that you've overcomplicated or you've stepped away from your main thing, and just to use those opportunities to reset. And I think the other thing with internal communications, the t-shirts, Spreetail, right? Can you walk around Lincoln and not see what's happening there? But the way that we energize our internal audience about that brand, to be excited, not just to wear it as a uniform, but to be authentically excited about sharing who you are, and what that represents, and what they, every time you put it on, what does that mean, or what is that pride? And so I think that's what doing something big like that can inspire your employees and help extend that message. Now, on kind of a slightly different scale, internal communications within a school. I have the privilege of visiting a lot of schools across Lincoln, and when I was there at Hartley a couple of weeks ago, I thought, well, this is perfect, because that internal, don't forget, you're going to have to repeat yourself. and by the way, don't forget you're going to have to repeat yourself, that these messages and all the different formats, they are celebrating what is core to the school and what they want their students to know and to understand, and what they want their teachers to express to their students and the parents, right? So say a message, say it many different ways, but stay consistent to that message. Because ultimately, we want people who are so committed and understand what our objectives are that they're taking it to the next level. So everybody should be branded with, it's two different people actually. Is that a great tattoo? So everybody, there's a special at Iron Brush, I'm just kidding. But the idea with internal communications is that we want to make sure that everybody feels on the same page, because they are that brand ambassador, right? They're taking our message out into the community and to our various audiences. We need to listen to the audience. We want to connect with the audience, as I said, engage or empower the audience, and then celebrate your brand ambassadors. I know that you have different groups of people in your organization that maybe fall into categories of like the energized, they're ready, and everything that you send out, they read all of it, and you think, man, there aren't enough gold stars. You're great. And then there's a few that, if this was even possible to have like an omniscient know-nothing, that person that they know everything about what's going on until you ask them that one thing, and they're like, oh, I didn't know anything about it. You can't be both. But so there's kind of that group. And then there's the group that you could put all of your energy into getting them on board and to hand deliver messages, which I do from time to time, and it's not going to sink in. Maybe the distractions are too great or the commitment is just different. My only advice and experience there is just let that be. Work even harder on the other groups to bring that message up and know that there are probably other things happening that are outside of your role as a communications director. So it's a project. We need to make sure that we're assembling the right tools, that we're getting all of our communications ears and cans ready, that we have the right resources, thinking about what you might need, thinking about that audience. Have you connected with one group but not the other? So timing of those things. Just making sure that we're really on the same page, ready to go, and that you've built up your message enough that people can either stick that message, understand it like a gymnastics landing, or get ready to pivot, because that adaptability is also important, and in internal communications, that's just as important, that sometimes you do have to change the direction, but that should not happen very often if you're really committed to the message there for the group. A couple of resources. I personally love Reagan.com. I feel like they have great communications information. Marcia kindly sent me a tip from IABC that about internal communications that came out, some articles. I'm starting to think I might need to join because, yeah, you've done your work. Because there were a couple of articles that, in their sly way, about internal communications that I was researching. I thought, oh, I'm kind of curious about that. Clicked on, could only get the starter of the article, right? So yeah, good work. I'm think we're closer. Thinking about things, though, but what are the things that are changing? Video, and I know, Krista, you guys, I don't know how much of this you do. We actually are going to be meeting with this retail team. We talked about that a little bit because I like that internal communications is really great. But figuring out what are the tools that you can use pretty easily if it's video or when it comes to messaging. We have 2 guys in our office that they will FaceTime each other because we're actually really far. The buildings are across a small parking lot. But one gentleman is in one building, one is in the other. And Bruce will frequently FaceTime Jason just to get a sense of, to ask him the silliest of questions. But I feel like that's a really good use of the tools that are available, because that face-to-face, time and again, we know that that makes it more personal. And so that's Bruce's way of establishing the connection with Bruce, and using the tools that we have today. One last suggestion, if you haven't viewed the culture slide deck from HubSpot, and I don't know how you couldn't because it has like 3 million views, probably 1 million are mine, but this slide deck is incredible. And it's like 150 slides, but every single one of them is a thinker. It really gets you going and sets up culture nicely, and it's that idea of it starts at the very beginning when they recruit people all the way through to building and growing them as employees. So it's a fascinating slide deck and something that I would strongly encourage. Again, that's the whole goal, that when we are able to effectively do the internal communications, we see that it's not just about a game of play, but it really becomes a work of art that we've created a masterpiece when we're doing it correctly. So that is what I have for you today.